Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. Did you know you can get Democracy Now!'s headlines and stories delivered directly to your inbox every day? Just text Democracy Now!, one word, no space. Text Democracy Now! To 66866 to subscribe to our daily digest, and you'll never miss a story. Once again, Democracy Now! One word to 66866. Thanks so much, and stay safe. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
You've been telling us for over 3 decades of the dangers of allowing the planet to warm. The world listened, but didn't hear. The world listened, but it did not act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now.
True.
Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster.
A code red for humanity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued a dire warning to the world, saying the climate crisis is inevitable and irreversible. But scientists say there is still time to prevent runaway global warming if drastic action is taken immediately. We'll speak to 2 of the lead authors of the IPCC report, which was just published this morning.
We've known for decades that the world is warming, and recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying. They're unprecedented in thousands of years, and they're indisputably linked to human activities.
Then we talked to a tenant organizer in Kansas City about how the Biden new eviction moratorium for much of the country does not go far enough.
This latest action by the administration is just a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. This is a very small step. It's the bare minimum. This will actually not offer the protections that are needed to keep them in their homes.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has issued its gravest warning yet, saying major irreversible climate catastrophe is unavoidable, that the world has a narrowing window to make drastic changes to prevent even greater devastation. That's according to the IPCC's first climate assessment in 8 years, which shows the world is on track to surpass an average temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, failing to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Even if the goal is met, the world will still have to contend with fast melting Arctic ice, sea level rise, and the warming and acidification of oceans, all of which contribute to more extreme weather events, including droughts, floods, wildfires, and deadly heat waves. The IPCC does not offer recommendations to governments, but the UN says countries need to immediately move away from fossil fuels and to stop adding carbon to the atmosphere by 2050 in order to slow or halt the most catastrophic outcomes. We'll talk to 2 of the IPCC report's lead authors after headlines. In Northern California, the Dixie Fire exploded in size over the weekend to become the largest single fire in California history, with 500,000 acres burned. On Saturday, California Governor Gavin Newsom toured Greenville, a gold rush-era town north of Sacramento, whose downtown almost completely was destroyed by the Dixie Fire.
The extreme weather conditions, extreme droughts are leading to extreme conditions and wildfire challenges, likes of which we've never seen in our history. And as a consequence, we need to acknowledge just straight up, these are climate-induced wildfires.
There are 11 major wildfires now raging across California and over 100 fires across 15 states, with more than 2 million acres burned. On Saturday, Denver, Colorado experienced the poorest air quality of any big city in the world as smoke from western fires filled the sky with a thick yellow-brown haze. Meanwhile, fires continue to rage across southern Europe, which is in a protracted heat wave. In Greece, thousands of people fled their homes on the island of Evia, some of them escaping aboard Coast Guard ships as a massive wildfire turned the night sky red.
I am very angry. Most people here are very angry. The disaster, you can see it, right? It's huge. Our villages are destroyed. There is nothing left from our homes, our properties, nothing.
The Taliban has seized control of 5 Afghan cities since Friday in Afghanistan as they continue their relentless offensive. Kunduz, Saripul, and Tulakan were the latest provincial capitals to fall to the Taliban Sunday, as the militant group also makes advances in the major cities of Kandahar and Lashkar Gah. The Biden administration reportedly has no plans to change its deadline of August 31st to complete the U.S. withdrawal, though it previously did not rule out continuing airstrikes beyond that date. On Friday, Taliban fighters assassinated the government's top media and information official in Kabul. Meanwhile, the UN Special Envoy for Afghanistan said more than 1,000 civilians were killed over the past month and that the war has now entered a, quote, deadlier and more destructive phase.
This is now a different kind of war, reminiscent of Syria recently, or Sarajevo in the not-so-distant past. To attack urban areas is to knowingly inflict enormous harm and cause massive civilian casualties.
At least 244,000 people in Afghanistan have also been internally displaced since the Taliban offensive started in May. As the U.S. is once again averaging over 100,000 new daily COVID-19 cases due to the Delta variant-driven surge, top White House advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci warned of future variants that could emerge unless more people get vaccinated.
If you give the virus a chance to continue to change, you're leading to a vulnerability that we might get a worse variant, and then that will impact not only the unvaccinated, that will impact the vaccinated, because that variant could evade the protection of the vaccine.
Though vaccine demand has increased in areas hit hard by Delta surges, health systems in some states say they're already overwhelmed. In Austin, Texas, officials activated the emergency text alert system to warn residents the situation is dire and healthcare resources limited. This comes as Governor Greg Abbott is fighting statewide mitigation efforts. In Florida, which accounts for nearly a quarter of the COVID cases nationwide, conservative radio host and anti-vaccine propagandist Dig Farrell died of COVID-19 last week. Before his death, he urged his friends to get vaccinated. He texted them from the hospital. Republican Governor Ron DeSantis has banned mask mandates and has threatened to withhold funds from Florida school districts that defy the ban. In a reversal, Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, said she supports requiring vaccines for teachers. The AFT is meeting this week to consider issuing the mandate. Dr. Fauci recently said he expects a flood of vaccine mandates as businesses and schools as soon as the shots receive full FDA approval. The Biden administration extended the pandemic-related freeze on federal student loan repayments through January 2022. It was set to expire at the end of September. Some Democrats renewed calls on Biden to use executive authority to cancel $50,000 of individual student debt. On Capitol Hill, senators voted Sunday evening to end debate over a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, clearing the way for a final vote early this week. The bipartisan bill would see the largest ever federal investments in public transit, clean water and green energy. But critics say it's far short of what's needed to tackle the climate crisis. The package is barely half of what President Biden proposed and far short of the $10 trillion Thrive Act favored by progressives. Senate Democrats are expected to turn to a $3.5 trillion budget resolution that could pass without Republican support, covering additional infrastructure needs. Democrats in the Texas House of Representatives refused to return to the state capitol in Austin Saturday, denying a quorum to Republicans who hope to pass draconian voter suppression bills in a special legislative session called by Governor Abbott. It was the third time Democrats have blocked the Republican governor's attempts to pass new election laws following their flight to Washington, D.C. last month. In other news from Texas, CBS News reports at least 36 holding facilities for unaccompanied migrant children may lose their state licenses next month, but will likely continue to operate without being subject to inspections or state oversight. Republican Governor Greg Abbott ordered state officials in May to stop issuing licenses to facilities for migrant children. In more immigration news, the Biden administration's begun flying deported Central American asylum seekers into Mexico instead of their home countries as an attempt to deter them from seeking refuge at the U.S.-Mexico border. Spanish humanitarian aid workers are reporting at least 42 refugees, including 8 children, are feared dead after their boat capsized off the coast of Western Sahara last week. Only 10 people survived. So far this year, over 1,100 refugees have perished crossing through dangerous sea routes as they attempt to reach Europe. In related news, a ship carrying at least 257 refugees has docked in the Italian port of Trapani a week after the German humanitarian organization Sea-Watch rescued the refugees off the coast of Tunisia. In Argentina, tens of thousands of people held demonstrations in Buenos Aires and throughout Argentina this weekend as anger mounted over skyrocketing unemployment and a worsening economic crisis triggered by the pandemic. This is a protester in Buenos Aires.
My brother is unemployed. Many of my neighbors are without a job. We see a lot of people are suffering around the country due to a lack of work. Politicians should get their act together. People are tired of lies.
In Thailand, protesters took to the streets of Bangkok Saturday demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha and denouncing the government's mishandling of the pandemic and economic crisis. Police assaulted protesters with tear gas and rubber bullets. It was the latest in a series of anti-government and anti-monarchy demonstrations demanding democratic reforms. This comes as Thailand reported nearly 22,000 new COVID-19 cases Saturday and at least 212 deaths, both new records. Former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen has testified that one of his deputies tried to help Donald Trump subvert the results of the 2020 election in the waning days of the presidency. That's according to the New York Times, which reports Rosen testified to Justice Department and Senate investigators over the weekend that his deputy, Jeffrey Clark, pressured Justice Department officials to publicly assert false claims about election fraud in order to cast doubt on the Electoral College results. Clark's promotion of conspiracy theories was reportedly welcomed by Trump, who considered replacing Rosen with Clark as acting Attorney General. A woman who last week filed a criminal complaint against New York Governor Andrew Cuomo for sexual misconduct has come forward to share her story. Brittany Camaso, who appeared as Executive Assistant 1 in the New York Attorney General's report on Cuomo, said the governor groped her, kissed her against her will, and verbally harassed her. She spoke to CBS's News' Jerrica Duncan.
Why did you file that criminal complaint with the sheriff's office?
It was the right thing to do. The governor needs to be held accountable.
And just so I'm clear again, being held accountable to you means seeing the governor charged with a crime.
What he did to me was a crime. He broke the law.
The New York State Judiciary Committee is meeting this morning to discuss potential impeachment proceedings. Meanwhile, Cuomo's top aide and fierce defender, Melissa DeRosa, resigned Sunday evening amidst the mounting scandal. And today marks 76 years since the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing at least 74,000 people just 3 days after the world's first atomic bomb killed some 140,000 people in Hiroshima. The treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons came into force earlier this year, but neither Japan nor the United States have signed it. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In its first major report in nearly a decade, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned the Earth could face runaway global warming unless drastic efforts are made to eliminate greenhouse gases. The IPCC said humans are, quote, unequivocally to blame for the climate crisis, which has already caused widespread and rapid changes. Scientists concluded average global temperatures will likely rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels by 2040, based on carbon emissions already in the atmosphere. The report also warns temperatures will continue to rapidly warm after 2040 unless drastic action is taken now. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the report a code red for humanity. He said, quote, if we combine forces now, we can avert climate catastrophe. But as today's report makes clear, there is no time for delay and no room for excuses, he said. The IPCC held a news conference this morning to release the 3,000-page report, which was worked on by over 200 scientists. Inger Andersen, executive director of the United Nations Environment Program, addressed the scientists involved in the project.
You've been telling us for over 3 decades of the dangers of allowing the planet to warm. The world listened, but didn't hear. The world listened, but it didn't act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster. We understand that climate change exacerbates already grave risks to biodiversity and natural managed habitats. Ecosystem degradation damages nature's ability to reduce the force of climate change. And as the IPCC Working Group 1 report reminds us, reducing greenhouse gases will not only slow climate change, but will improve air quality. It's all connected.
Greenpeace UK Executive Director John Sovan said the effects of the climate crisis can already be seen across the globe.
You can just read the headlines. You know, the wildfires out of control in Greece and Turkey, the heat domes in California and British Columbia in Canada, the wildfires out of control in Siberia, the floods in Germany and in China. You just look anywhere around the world and you see climate catastrophe unfolding. All this report is doing really is putting the science behind this, saying that we are now certain this is human-induced.
We're joined now by 2 of the lead authors of the IPCC report. Bob Kopp is professor and director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences at Rutgers University, and Kim Cobb is professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech. Professor Cobb, let's begin with you. You're one of the lead authors of this report. Can you talk about the scope and the significance of what you found?
Sure. So this report is obviously an unprecedented new foundation for our science and our world at this critical moment. It is, something that involved hundreds of authors over the last 3 years and really assessed the relevant scientific literature across 14,000 different articles in the published peer-reviewed literature to make assessments as to where we are with human-caused climate change and where we're going and what lies ahead and the choices that we have to make. So really a stunning historic pillar in our field and a reminder of the futures that we have to choose in the next decades.
The UN Secretary General has called the IPCC report Code Red for Humanity. What surprised you most about the findings? Hundreds of scientists around the world assessing so many of the studies that have taken place over the last years.
Well, I think one of the things to remember is how far the science has come. We're going from virtually certain human-caused climate change in the last report to unequivocal wording for this report in terms of human influence on climate, and thinking about piling up on the absolutely factual column more and more aspects of the impacts of climate change. And this report, I think, makes a very strong emphasis on the rising climate and weather extremes that have been more uncertain in previous reports. This year, the science has, over the last years, the science has matured to the point that a lot of strong wording in this report around the links between human-caused climate change and any number of different climate extremes.
Professor Robert Kopp, talk about the major findings of the report.
Sure. So as my colleague was saying, this report is in some cases a sort of an exclamation mark on what the previous reports have already said. So we've known for decades that the world is warming. We know that the changes we're seeing now are widespread, they're rapid, they're intensifying, they're unprecedented in thousands of years. Carbon dioxide levels are higher than they've been in at least 2 million years. Temperatures are higher than they've been in at least 100,000 years. Sea level is rising faster than it has in at least 3,000 years. And it's indisputable that these changes are linked to human activities. And these changes are affecting every inhabited region of the Earth. Some of them are already locked in, but even for the ones that are going to respond most slowly to reductions in greenhouse gases, like changes in the ice sheets and sea level, we still have the opportunity to slow the rate and ultimate extent of warming. And other changes, like the rise in temperature, can be stopped pretty quickly if we bring our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero.
What are some? Go ahead.
In order to hit the ambitious target laid out in the Paris Agreement of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees C, we're going to need immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But the other point I want to make sure comes across, because I think you hear this a lot, is that we shouldn't be thinking about this as though there is a magic line at 1.5 degrees or at any level below which we're safe and above which we're not. You're already talking about, as we said, already experiencing more extremes. So we're already experiencing enhanced hazards as a result of climate change. And every bit of warming, whether it's above or below 1.5 degrees C, increases the risks that we face. So anything we can do to limit the amount of warming will reduce the hazards we're creating for ourselves.
You're an oceans expert, Robert Kopp. So if you can talk about what the greatest sources of sea level rise are expected to be in the next century and what has happened so far, the major causes of sea level rise.
Sure. So as I already said, sea level is rising now at a faster rate than it has in at least 3,000 years, and it's rising at an accelerating rate. And this is due to two main factors. The first is the loss of ice on land from glaciers and from the polar ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. And the second is the warming of the oceans as the planet heats up. And there's been a continuing acceleration since about 1970 with ice sheets in particular, the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheet, driving the increase in the rate of sea level rise over the last 20 years. And of all of the factors that are driving sea level rise, we can clearly try the expansion of the ocean, the melting of glaciers, and the melting of the Greenland ice sheet to human-caused activity. And finally, this is already having effects around the world. So since the 1960s, we've seen nearly a doubling in many coastal sites of the frequency of high water levels.
We're going to break and then come back to our discussion with Professors Bob Kopp and Kim Cobb, two of the lead reporters on the new IPCC report just released this morning. We'll also go to Bangladesh or speak to a leading Bangladeshi scientist. Stay with us.
Where the
Trust by the Weather Station. Tamara Lindemann says the new album, Ignorance, is inspired by climate grief. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to Greta Thunberg, who has just responded to the new IPCC report.
We have not once been treating this crisis like an actual crisis. And of course, media is reporting now about extreme weather events and consequences of the climate crisis. But then again, we also have to remember that these are all just symptoms of the climate crisis. We're not talking about the root cause itself, the things that is actually fueling these events. We are not holding people in power accountable. We are not talking about the current best available science, what it says, and how the situation looks like now. And we are especially not talking about the gap between what politicians are saying and what they are actually doing. This report doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't say you have to do this and then you have to do this. It doesn't provide us with such solutions or tell us that you need to do this. And that's up for us. We are the ones who need to take the decisions, and we are the ones who need to be brave and ask the difficult questions to ourselves, like what do we value? Are we ready to take action to ensure future and present living conditions? So I hope that this can be a wake-up call and that it really gives perspective, and that it once again can be a reminder that the climate crisis has not gone away. It's only escalating and it's only growing more intense by the hour.
That's Greta Thunberg responding to the new IPCC report. She was responding from Stockholm, Sweden. This is Democracy Now! As we talk about the report, the 3,000-page report, almost a decade in the making. We are joined by two leading IPCC scientists, and we go to Bangladesh to speak as well with Salim Ul-Haq, climate scientist, director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He's been a longtime IPCC lead author, now joining us from Dhaka. Your response to this report, Salim?
Thank you very much, Amy. My response is that this report has actually ushered in what I call the new era of loss and damage from human-induced climate change in an absolutely scientifically verifiable and attributable manner. There is no question at all that what we are seeing on our TV screens across the world in terms of the wildfires, the heat dome effect in the North America, floods in China and India, are now, the severity of all of these have been increased because of human-induced climate change by enhancing the global temperature 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial, and the path to keeping it below 1.5 degrees is diminishing by the hour, as Greta Thunberg said.
Did anything surprise you in this report, Salim? And describe specifically what's happening in Bangladesh.
So this is not a surprising report. It's an assessment of, as you've heard, 14,000 scientific papers which already exist and we've known about. It brings it all together and makes the case for urgency, I think, very, very strong. The new aspect of it, I would say, has already been alluded to by one of the lead authors, is that the science on attribution of extreme events has become a lot better. It used to be the case that these extreme weather events that we have could not be tied to human-induced climate change as they are now able to be done. So the heat dome effect in North America, for example, could not have happened without the human-induced climate change taking place. The severity of the wildfires in southern Europe would not be so severe without human-induced climate change, and so on and so forth. These events are not caused by climate change, but they are becoming much, much, much more severe because of human-induced climate change having already raised global mean temperature by 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial. So in Bangladesh, where I live, we've known this for over a decade. This is all old news. None of this is new news. It happens all the time. We are a country of 170 million people living on less than 150,000 square kilometers on the delta of two of the world's biggest rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, and also susceptible to major cyclones coming in from the Bay of Bengal into hitting our country. So we've seen just a year and a bit ago, a super cyclone hit us called Amphan in May of 2020. It became a super cyclone while it was in the Bay of Bengal because the sea surface temperature was 2 degrees above normal. In past decades, super cyclones of that magnitude have actually killed hundreds of thousands of people. The good news is they don't anymore. Bangladesh has probably the best cyclone warning and evacuation system in the whole world. 3 million people were evacuated and took shelter, and the death rate was in the few dozens of people, most of whom were fishermen who were out at sea and didn't get back to land in time. 3 million people on land took shelter and survived. But nevertheless, the cyclone did a lot of damage. People lost their homes, their crops, their livelihood, infrastructure. So even though the death rate has been brought down considerably, the destruction was not able to be prevented. And there'll be more of that coming in the future.
Salim ul Haq, the biggest greenhouse gas emitters are China and the United States. What do these two countries have to do?
These two countries are the key. The United States is still, even though China is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter now, the United States is still cumulatively the biggest contributor to the fact that we now have global temperature above 1.2 degrees centigrade. So both these countries are going to have to step up their game, and to me, they are key. If they can do it, everybody else will follow. They've done some, one must give credit for that, but they haven't done enough. And hopefully this report will spur them on to take even faster, more drastic action to wean themselves off fossil fuels on coal, petroleum and natural gas as quickly as possible and segue into a cleaner energy world of renewable energies like solar, wind, together with storage, which is a key factor in utilizing these intermittent energy sources like wind and solar. With these three technologies, we should be able to wean ourselves off fossils very quickly and go into a new world based on renewable energies. The faster we do that, the better off everybody, including Americans and Chinese, will be. America and China are also quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as they just found out in the last few weeks. So they're not going to be able to adapt as quickly either. So the sooner they can reduce their emissions, the better. And the rest of the world will follow. They are the two key players.
Let me put this question to Robert Kopp. You have these massive issues of extreme weather. You have the western wildfires, California, Oregon, Washington, and yet it's Denver, Colorado that experiences the worst air quality in the world of any major city this weekend because of those fires in the West. You have the fires in Greece, the flooding in Bangladesh, where Salim ul Haq is. Is this the best we can hope for in the future? Is there any way to even mitigate against these kind of extreme weathers? Is this as good as it gets?
You know, what we're basically facing is a world with about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And so even if we're, looking forward, we're talking about 1.5 or 2 degrees C. And what we can say is that every increment of warming is going to make these sorts of impacts more severe. So in order to stop things from getting worse, we need to get, as my colleague was saying, we need to get global greenhouse gas emissions to net zero, which requires a global effort. These sorts of changes we see are basically what we see with the level of warming that we have. And we're not coming back to this level of warming. So these are indeed going to get worse. But I think it's important for us to bear in mind that we have very real control over how much worse they get.
Professor Kopp, you are a specialist and you've done a lot of work around preserving coral reefs in the world. Can you talk about the effects of climate change on these coral reefs and why this is so significant, an indicator of what's happening all over the world, even outside the coral reefs?
Yes, the report flags as an incredibly vulnerable ecosystem to current warming levels as well as future warming levels. Corals live in a relatively narrow temperature tolerance where if that temperature is exceeded, they bleach first, and that's something that has hit the headlines in recent years. And if those conditions persist for even a matter of weeks, the corals will die. And in 2016, we had a global scale marine heat wave associated with one of the largest El Nino events on record, which is a natural climate cycle that, when superimposed on current warming levels of just over 1 degree, was enough to bring to our records this historic coral bleaching and mortality event that swept every tropical ocean basin in the world. And so many of us who study coral reefs were taken aback by just how quickly these extreme temperatures are at our doorstep and the absolutely devastating losses that reefs incurred in that year, a real wake-up call with respect to the ongoing risks on reef systems. It's really important to remember that these reef systems are critical to the economies of so many island nations and tropical nations around the world and provide the vast source of protein for over 1 billion people.
Professor Salim Ul-Haq, I wanted to ask you about these massive incidents of extreme weather, the floods in Europe and South Asia, the wildfires in Greece, the United States, as well as Siberia. Can you talk about how so often in the past we saw this in poorer countries, but now we're seeing it in the industrialized world repeatedly, relentlessly? Can you talk about the change in media coverage because of that?
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, in Bangladesh and indeed in the rest of the global south, this is not news at all. We've known this for the last decade. We've been suffering. We've been dealing with it as best we can, with the rest of the global media not taking much interest, maybe a few seconds to report on a flood or a drought or a hurricane, and that was it. Now that it's happening in the rich world, in Europe and in the United States, it's getting a lot more wall-to-wall television coverage. I've been watching TV all day here in Dhaka about the Greek wildfires in Greece. I'm sure the Greeks never saw a wall-to-wall coverage of what happened in Bangladesh when we had floods and cyclones. So that's a good thing, in everybody now realizing we're in the same boat and facing the same storm, even if we're not all in exactly the same kind of boat. But one of the interesting issues here is what the rich countries can actually learn from the poorer countries like Bangladesh. I mentioned that Bangladesh has brought down the death rate of these events in a very, very significant fashion by providing early warning and evacuation for people. The number of deaths that we saw in Germany, in one of the richest countries in the world, nearly 200 Germans actually died from flash floods, would never have happened in Bangladesh. We would have evacuated them. We do evacuate everybody that's in the path of floods or in cyclones. In Germany, they weren't able to do that. So Germany could learn a lot from Bangladesh, and so could the United States, on how to deal with these impacts that they have not been used to, but we are used to doing them.
As we wrap up, Salim Ul-Haq, if you can talk about the significance of the climate summit that's taking place in Glasgow, if in fact it happens as an in-person event or just a virtual one because of COVID, but the significance of this summit.
I think the Glasgow summit, the COP26, is going to be perhaps the most significant COP that we've had. Just a reminder that this was actually supposed to have been held last year in December 2020, and it got postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic for valid reasons. The COVID-19 pandemic didn't allow it to be held, so it was postponed by 12 months. But that's a very critical 12 months because climate change didn't take 12 months off. It's actually taking place, and I would say it actually crossed a threshold, which we've just seen with the IPCC 6th assessment report, that we are now living in a climate change world. And so, as I said, we are now in the era of having to deal with loss and damage from human-induced climate change. And that's going to be one of the topics that the vulnerable countries are going to bring up. Indeed, they've already brought it up in COP26 for treating it seriously, which has not been done so far. We've been talking about it for a long time. We've not been getting anywhere with it. Now it's for the rich countries to recognize it's a reality and do what they're supposed to do, which is implement what they agreed to implement in Paris, keep the global temperature below 1.5 degrees and provide $100 billion a year to the developing countries to tackle climate change. They promised but didn't deliver.
We want to thank you all for being with us. Salim Haq, Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. Also want to thank Bob Kopp, Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean and Atmospheric Sciences, speaking to us from New Brunswick, New Jersey, and Kim Cobb, Professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to tenant organizer in Kansas City about how President Biden's new eviction moratorium for much of the country doesn't go far enough. Stay with us.
But the soft words, they all spoke so gentle, yeah. It makes it easier to bear, yeah. You won't regret it, no. Young girls, they don't forget it.
Try a Little Tenderness by Otis Redding. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Landlords in Georgia and Alabama have asked a federal judge to block the Biden administration's new 2-month moratorium on evictions. The new CDC moratorium covers areas of the United States where there's substantial or high spread of the coronavirus. That's about 90% of the country. Nationwide moratorium on evictions expired at the end of July after Democratic lawmakers failed to pass a bill to protect the millions of renters who could be forced from their homes. But then a group of lawmakers, led by Representative Cori Bush of Missouri, began camping out on the steps of the U.S. Capitol to pressure the Biden administration to take action. In a moment, we'll be joined by a leading housing activist. But first, we turn to a tenant in Kansas City who's on the verge of losing his home. His name is Akeem Greedington. He spoke to Democracy Now! Last week.
Because my landlord is essentially just 1 month behind on rent. I came home one evening to a 3-day eviction notice on my door, which I later found out isn't really the process for how evictions go. So I really felt like my landlord was trying to intimidate me or like harass me because not only was there the 3-day eviction notice on my door, but there was also notice of non-renewal. So my lease ends September 30th. So whether I get the funds or not, I still have to be out of here. I ended up behind not only with rent, but utilities and I mean, really just kind of life in general, just through mental health surrounding the pandemic. I struggle with depression and anxiety as it is. That on top of a lot of the racial trauma we've been enduring, as well as a lot of the misinformation and just the way people are treating each other just kind of compounds and adds to this energy. For me, I just became extremely overwhelmed. And my leave was unpaid. So I just kind of got into a position where I fell, behind. So I've tried to make a payment plan. I informed them the very first day when I started working and that I just need time. None of those things really made a difference. And it was very frustrating for myself to be someone that, aside from my leave that I took, I'm someone that works full time. I'm someone that pays my rent on time time every month. And the first time I have any sort of an issue at a time when the world is dealing with something unprecedented, it just made zero sense to me, like very unempathetic, that you can only be concerned about money at this time. It's definitely a high anxiety moment because I don't have a mom and dad that I can call to, go stay with or ask for money or anything like that. I actually have my dad's ashes, and one of my big concerns is, if I get kicked out on the street, like, what am I going to do with my dad's ashes? And I think those are things that these landlords don't think about when they make these decisions from these boardrooms, is the real effect that it has on people.
That's Key Gradington speaking to Democracy Now! From Kansas City about his fight to stay in his home. He says he doesn't have a father or mother to just go live in their house. In fact, he has his father's ashes with him. We're joined now by Tara Raghuveer, director of KC Tenants, which is a grassroots tenant-led organization in Kansas City, Missouri, which is also the Homes Guarantee campaign director at People's Action. We thank you so much for being with us. Let's continue with Aki, to use him as an example to understand what's happening right now. We just reported that the Biden administration, under enormous pressure, led by a formerly unhoused person, now Congress member Cori Bush, and Ilhan Omar of Minneapolis and Ayanna Pressley of Boston, slept out on the Capitol steps to protest the lack of extension of a rent moratorium. So they got that extension ultimately, but it's not for the entire country. And what does it mean in Aki's case? How is this playing out on the ground for millions of people, Tara?
Well, Amy, thank you so much for having me back. And you're absolutely right to give kudos to Representative Cori Bush and Representative Ilhan Omar. I want to start there because I think what they demonstrated through their actions on Friday and through the weekend is that more often than not, when someone in power tells you that something is impossible, they're lying to you, right? And these congresswomen, empowered by and driven by their own direct experience, that's not dissimilar to Aki's, took the action that they needed to take in order to fight for millions of renters across the country. So kudos is owed to them. And this latest action by the administration is just a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. This is a very small step. It's the bare minimum. And for many tenants, including Aki, this will actually not offer the protections that are needed to keep them in their homes. Aki tells us in his story that he's at risk of eviction, but currently his landlord has just threatened him with legal action. That means that he's putting notices on the door and harassing Aki to tell him to get out. He's actually not even using the formal eviction process. And we see this so often, that tenants are displaced even outside of the court's purview. And then the other thing that Aki tells us is that his lease is just not going to be renewed, right? So his landlord will be able to get around this eviction moratorium by, instead of evicting him for back owed rent, which is what's protected at the federal level, evicting him for possession of the property. And that eviction is actually not banned by this eviction moratorium. And therefore, Aki is one of millions of tenants who will be evicted because their landlords will unfortunately exploit this loophole.
What's happened to the billions of dollars under COVID relief that were allocated to deal with these crises?
To put it bluntly, rental assistance has been a disaster, and the tenant movement knew that it would be, right? Last March 2020, we were calling for rent and mortgage cancellation, and we worked very closely with Representative Ilhan Omar and her team to introduce that legislation to Congress. That would have been automatic, and it would have been universal. Rent and mortgage cancellation would have canceled all rent payments. It would have made the rent, back owed rent, uncollectible and unevictable. rental, and then landlords could apply directly for the relief that they needed that would be conditioned on a set of tenant protections. Now, instead of any of that, we have a bureaucratic, non-automatic, means-tested program in rental assistance, and the money is not getting to the tenants who need it. Not only is it a major bailout for the industry, a lot of governors like ours in Missouri are just sitting on money. Our governor, Mike Parson, is sitting on $250 million that are not getting to tenants who need it across his state. Our city in Kansas City has closed down their rental assistance applications, even though they are sitting on the second round of the emergency rental assistance money from the federal government. And at this point, a lot of tenants, of course, are facing eviction before they've ever had a chance to access that funding to stay in their homes.
But why can't you get that freed up? How can they be closing? How can they not be giving it out?
I wish I had the answers for you, Amy. We've been asking everyone who will talk to us, but unfortunately, when policy is made in this way, when the federal government is handing money down to states and localities, that money becomes political really quickly, right? We saw that money get held up at the state level, at the county level, and at the city level as people played political games with other people's lives, right? And unfortunately, now it's too little too late for a lot of the tenants who were most at risk or most urgently at risk. They will be displaced, or they've already been displaced before they can ever access those funds.
So let's be clear that the moratorium on evicting renters actually began under Trump, and then Biden re-extended it. And now, only because of enormous pressure, has come up with a kind of new one. So given that it was established under the former president who is a developer, what do you see? Who does it actually protect? And how many people are going to lose their homes, do you predict, Tara?
The timing of the Trump moratorium is notable. Trump, the developer-in-chief, right before his reelection, which was ultimately unsuccessful, issued this federal moratorium. It was September 2020. And it was, crumbs that he was throwing at poor and working class people to try to win some votes, right? It was a political move. The policy was never well written. From the beginning, it was extremely flawed. It was not written in a way that was actually going to keep the majority of poor and working class tenants in their homes. It only protects against evictions on the basis of rent, meaning that landlords from the beginning have been able to exploit those loopholes and start evicting people for other reasons, lease violations, for the possession of property, just not renewing leases as a way of getting people out. Also, this policy was never automatic. So it didn't just ban evictions. It said, here's a form that tenants have to fill out to apply for protection. But that requires the tenant to know that this protection exists. So tenant organizations like ours worked overtime to make sure that the information on the moratorium got out to people. And still, there are a lot of people who never got that information. Fundamentally, the Trump order the Trump order left so much discretion up to local judges that many courts just kept the eviction dockets open and continued evicting people. And it's important for people to note that the Biden order that was issued on Tuesday is actually in many ways more restrictive than the Trump order was to begin with.
Meaning, what does it leave out? Who does it leave out?
So it's not automatic. It doesn't apply to every eviction, and now it's limited to geographies that are distinctly impacted by the Delta variant and by spiking cases. But if case numbers go down in a given geography for a 14-day period, the protection could expire for that locality, for that geography.
So, Tara, you are the director of KC Tenants, which is a grassroots tenant-led organization in Kansas City. You engage in a lot of eviction defense. What does that mean, and what are you doing now?
For the better part of the last year, we have had to take matters into our own hands and disrupt evictions by any means necessary. And this is only after months of advocacy at the local level, at the state level, to try to get our courts to close down, to try to get the state to cancel rent. ultimately we were unsuccessful and the people in power were not listening to the people. And so July of last year, I think, was the first disruption that we attempted in the downtown courthouse in Kansas City. We had people go into the courthouse and verbally disrupt. We had people on the phone lines because evictions were also happening by conference call. And then we iterated on those tactics over the course of several months, ultimately culminating in what we called Zero Eviction January. It was the dead of winter. It was cold. COVID numbers were spiking. And we decided that we were going to try to shut down every eviction in Kansas City for the month of January. And ultimately, we were successful. We interrupted over 90% of the court's attempts to evict people that month.
So you have Kansas City now, metropolitan area, reporting 1,115 new COVID-19 cases on Wednesday, the highest daily number since January. So you would be included in this eviction moratorium, which ends in 2 months. What do you expect will happen then?
We're included in this moratorium that ends in 2 months, but evictions have been happening the entirety of the past year in Kansas City. There are evictions happening in downtown Kansas City today. There are 150 eviction cases on the docket today in downtown Kansas City, including at least a few Casey Tenants members, including one named Sabrina Davis, who's already been displaced from her home. So I think it's very important that we start there. Evictions are happening. They've been happening. They will continue to occur even under this federal moratorium. And to your point, we will be in the same place that we were on Saturday come October 3rd, right? We're just kicking the can down the road. We in the tenant movement have always known that an eviction moratorium was not going to save us. We actually need, and the Biden administration and Congress need, to confront this system that commodifies one of our basic needs, which is our homes, and tells us that our homes are just someone else's investment. With every eviction that we allow, whether it's during a pandemic or not, what we are doing is prioritizing one person's profits over another person's life, and that is not okay.
We just interviewed Cori Bush in the midst of her protests that has led to the Biden administration doing something temporary here. She introduced the Unhoused Bill of Rights. You are proposing a National Tenants Bill of Rights. What would that look like?
Absolutely. In the Homes Guarantee, what we envision is a country in which we can guarantee that everyone has a safe, accessible, and truly affordable home. This sounds simple, but of course it's a premise that's complicated by what we like to call a conspiracy of the profiteers that has convinced us that the only way to deliver housing is through the private market. Now more than ever, now when the federal government is moving hundreds of billions of dollars in a bailout to the rental industry, what we need is a correction of the power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Tenants need more power. They need more control over their homes, over where they live, how long they get to live there, over their choices in the rental market before we fully transition away from the market model, which is ultimately the goal. So we in the Homes Guarantee campaign have envisioned a National Tenants Bill of Rights. But importantly, actually, before we go to talk to anyone in D.C., even our closest champions, what we know that we need to do is build the power in the field to win a National Tenants Bill of Rights. We actually can't exist in the realm of message bills anymore. It's not going to cut it. We learned some hard lessons during the fight for cancel rent about that power that we do not have to win what we need yet. So currently we're in the process of the largest field operation that the tenant movement has ever seen. We're attempting to engage over 1 million tenants in the process of writing their own rights into existence. And through that process, we're hoping to build the power that we will ultimately need to not only introduce a National Tenants Bill of Rights that's written by us, but also win that National Tenants Bill of Rights to correct that balance of power in the direction of the tenant.
Tara Raghuveer, director of KC Tenants, which is a grassroots tenant-led organization based in Kansas City. She's also with People's Action. To see our interviews last week with Congress members Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush, who both slept outside on the Capitol steps to demand the Biden administration reimpose the rent moratorium, go to democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe, protect yourself, your family, community, wear a mask.